Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our workshop today, September 19th, 2023. We will have a hard stop at 4 o'clock because we have our board meeting in Venice, which it will start tonight at 6:30. And we have three main items on today's agenda, so I'll hand it over to the superintendent to introduce our first speaker.
Thank you, Madam Chair. We have three items that we would hopefully be able to get through from up till our 4 o'clock deadline. The first one is our legislative platform and looking at the proposed priorities and, of course, getting your input as we rank them and edit them for final approval at the October 3rd board meeting. We have our new Supervisor of Government Affairs with us today, Ms. Chris Parento. You've all had a chance to meet him. He's been working feverishly since he's been on board looking at policies that are up for revision, and then, of course, our legislative platform. So I'm going to toss it over to Chris to talk about our first item, which is our legislative priorities.
Thank you, Superintendent Connor. Good afternoon, Madam Chair, members of the board. For a little bit of background, we've been working over the last few weeks, like the superintendent said, to try to lay out a list of priorities that will put us in a good place legislatively moving into the session over the next few weeks. Interim committee meetings have already started in Tallahassee this week, and those will be continuing. There are some deadlines for appropriations project requests that we're going to need to get to over the next few weeks if we have any appropriations that we are going to be asking for at the state level. So I've been working with the superintendent, working with different department leaders throughout the district, as well as with our lobbyist up in Tallahassee, Capital City Consulting, just to make sure that we're aligning ourselves where we need to be and putting this platform together in a robust way to provide you as board members with options today to look through what we have and decide how many priorities we want to bring forward for the legislative session. I know that last year the board brought 7 priorities, so doing so again would not be something that's out of the ordinary. However, there is the opportunity to pare some of these down and decide which ones we want to focus on, which ones we want to bring to Tallahassee as a district and through our lobbyists so that they can be the boots on the ground for us going forward into this legislative session. So we've got a few of them laid out here for you today, and we'll just go through those kind of one by one. And then once we get through that, we can determine whether we want to discuss each one further, if there are any additional that the board wishes to add as we decide which way we want to go forward, and then decide how many we truly want to bring as our platform that we would bring back to the board to adopt at the October 3rd meeting.
May I interrupt really quickly? Do we have anyone from Capital City with us?
Not on the call.
Okay.
So looking at a couple of different areas of these priorities, we have statewide priorities that it was recommended from Capital City that we look into in terms of things that a lot of districts across the state may be looking at, and then tailoring those for what our needs may be, and then some local potential priorities as we move forward. So moving one by one through these, on the funding side, there is an opportunity to request that the state maintain the funding for teacher compensation. That was an increase last year during the legislative session, and the Florida Department of Education has already put out their budget requests for the upcoming session, and in that they again requested an increase in BSA funding. They again requested an increase in the total FEFP for the upcoming year, and we could, in talking with Capital City, request that we either stick with the levels they requested or even request higher amounts as something on our end. We would also want to consider requesting that they retain the full calculation of RLE, considering new construction and property assessments, and incorporate additional cost factors into the FEFP for high-cost counties. We would want to make sure the state ensure that no new mandates are not fully funded and without reducing other allocations. And also a consideration to offer funding for optional summer school for all students. Another request could be to request that the $2 million levy for various capital purposes is restored and ensure full funding for class sizes. So those are just some options that we have to put under consideration on the funding side. We can incorporate all of these or any of these as we work to write the legislative platform. The next one would be school safety, and we would request the state provide additional resources for district threat management teams expand the Safe Schools component of FEFP by at least the amount requested by the Department of Education, and the number on that request from the Florida Department of Education was $40 million for this year. Also asking that they increase the mental health allocation funding by at least the $20 million that was requested by the Department of Education, and continue financial support for school safety infrastructure, while also allocating funding for stronger cybersecurity measures and database modernization. For teacher recruitment and retention, I know that last year, well, earlier this year in January, when the discussion happened about the 2023 priorities, there was some discussion with Capital City about the teachers returning from FRS retirement and what that timeline looked like as to what was considered reasonable by the IRS. There is still that back and forth at the state level. Some are saying 3 months, some 6 months, some sticking with the 12 months. That's something, if the board wishes to consider adding that in as part of this platform, we can. But some of the things we could request are exempting penalties for certified out-of-field teachers teaching related subjects, increasing funding for mid-career teacher and support staff salaries, authorizing school districts to use the mental health allocation to fund school counselors, school social workers, and nurse bonuses to help with recruitment and retention in those positions. And similar to what the state does with military and retired first responders and veterans, funding the cost of background checks for bus drivers and for teachers. In terms of pre-K and early learning, increasing the funding and resources available to pre-K students and families across the district by bolstering the investment in full-day VPK options, introducing pre-K options to 3-year-olds, and modifying school readiness preschool applications to fund wraparound services for pre-K students. Accountability. The state's accountability system is anchored in the assessment program to uphold educational excellence, ensure equitable learning opportunities, and provide valuable insights to drive informed decision-making of educational leadership. We would want to ensure that there are actionable results from fast progress monitoring tests and abolish the automatic yearly adjustments to the school grading scale, while also preserving flexibility for students to achieve graduation concordance through the post-secondary education readiness testing. Deregulation, this is one that I had a lot of conversations with Capital City Consulting about, and this is something that they worked with us on the language to try to make sure that we're putting ourselves in a good place legislatively if we do want to bring this priority forward. And that would be decreasing regulations, allowing traditional public schools the same leeway granted to academically high-performing school districts, and the operational adaptability given to charter schools. And by that, eliminating any requirement of the public school system above what is required of charter schools from the state in terms of regulations. Healthcare costs, I know, Mr. Edwards, this was brought up in the August 15th workshop when Ms. Peterson was presenting, and I spoke with her about putting this together to ensure that the increased regulations on pharmacy benefit managers, including preventing plans from requiring participants to use certain pharmacies, ultimately lead to increased transparency in the pricing and cost impacts to both districts and to the insured individuals. From a local perspective, I've talked to the superintendent about these, and I talked with Dr. DePillo about STC. On the Holocaust education side, we would request that the state renew or increase last year's $500,000 allocation for the Jewish Federation of Sarasota Manatee's Holocaust Education Center. And that allocation, the funding would help build a comprehensive professional learning program to equip district educators to meet and exceed Florida's Holocaust education mandate for grades 5 through 12, including providing summer teacher training. It would provide customized, age-appropriate curriculum and educational materials, and provide for the cost of bus transportation and related education for regular student field trips to the center throughout the district. For STC, and talking with Dr. DePillo, one of his requests is that the state recreate the funding formula for workforce fund allocation. The 3-year running average doesn't support a growing enrollment model. A request to fund technical colleges at 100% of the state funding model, and continue to fully fund the credentials of values aligned with post-secondary and secondary CTE programs, while continuing to fund expedited training such as fast track, rapid credentialing, and quick response to meet employer high demand entry-level positions while providing a living wage, benefits, and career opportunities to local talent. So board members, I think now we can have some discussion about just your thoughts and, really determine the number of priorities that we want to establish as a district for our platform and work through what we want to include and how we want to craft our language to bring it to the state level.
Thank you, Mr. Parento. I just want to make a couple comments and then just a reminder that there's no buzzer, so just use your finger. But thank you for this. I will say that just my 2 cents are to be very narrow on what's important and impactful to Sarasota, particularly when we're talking about appropriations. I know we've talked about a couple different things leading up to this. CTE has been a consistent area where we focus and have had successes. Personally, I'd like to see that move forward. I know one specific project, and I wish Capital City was here because there are strategies before we put this together, and there will be some steps. But I would like my personal thing that I'd like to put forward, not personal, but is to go forward with some appropriation requests. But the guidance that we get from our lobbyists will help. And sometimes you can go big without shooting yourself in the foot, and obviously not us expecting all of it, although we'd like that. But the farm project is one that I believe we've talked about. I think I've talked to people locally here. I think there's a lot of opportunity with private partnerships as well. That's something the legislature looks very highly on, and having conversations preliminarily just with members of this community and other members of the legislature. It just seems that it's a unique and interesting project, so it wasn't listed on here, but I know that particular, and I know Dr. DePillo is here, but I think the number was 3.5 is coming up in my mind as for my notes, but again, I don't know what that encompasses as far as the district or private partners, but we go into the next step, but I just want to put that on the radar for the board members. I want to bring up the Holocaust because I know we brought this up. I mentioned it last year, and yes, there is a graduation requirement. As many of you know, we have a very strong chapter for the Sarasota Manatees Holocaust, the Jewish Federation here. They've done tremendous work on their site, and I think we all talk about being a model for the state in various areas. I think this is one area that we could be. As many people may know that survivors are aging out, and we have a unique opportunity to really utilize that facility to help our educators learn and be trained from them, but also have our students tour the facility. I understand that there is and learn, and it doesn't have to be just for a week or a month, but we could really expand on it. I've had some good conversations. I believe board members have had some great conversations. And so that's one area I think would be unique and interesting and could be a model for other areas, but also be another area that we could also expand in academics with other areas in our community. I think the Newtown community is another great area that we can leverage our partners in our community to help us with a lot of the teacher training and also the education. And I think it would be a win-win, which I know my colleague, Mrs. Rose, likes. So I just wanted to highlight those 2 areas. I saw Dr. DePillo came up here, so if you wanted to narrow that in, but I also want to hear from other board members, but just wanted to set the stage on those overarching issues. Mrs. Rose.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm in full agreement with everything that Mrs. Ziegler has stated, and particularly the win-win part. I do want to emphasize, in addition to that, pre-kindergarten opportunities. I know that I've had an opportunity to talk directly with 2 of our local delegates, Representative Fiona McFarland and James Buchanan, and they're both interested in connecting with the superintendent and getting more specifics to support those pre-kindergarten opportunities. So if there's the will of the board to prioritize that, it's an opportunity to perhaps get some our delegates invested. I think that going and looking at the GOCIO program last spring was phenomenal. It's like looking at gifted kindergartners at the end of the year, and quite an advantage. When I look at the accountability piece, for the FAST testing. I'm just focusing in on the progress monitoring system, and I very much like the actionable results. I think it aligns us in a win-win with the state's expectations of growing achievement and gives our teachers the highest caliber of tools when we focus in on that one item. And then, of course, without appropriate growing funding for teacher pay, we won't go anywhere. If we don't have teachers in place, not only teachers, but retaining and recruiting high-quality teachers. So those are the pieces I wanted to reinforce. Thank you, Madam Chair.
I have a quick question. When does our so committee week start? I think timeline is so important. We oftentimes don't discuss it, but that's one of the main strategies. So they start, when does committee week start?
So the first week of interim committees for the House is this week. There's only a couple meetings going on, and then they're back in mid-October. The first week of the Senate's committees are the week of the 9th in October, and those run through mid-December. Appropriations project requests are due November 14th, and then the session kicks off January 9th. So quite a bit earlier this year than it was last year.
And for that reason, working backwards for the board from a timeline standpoint, getting something together that we would approve, therefore the work go forward and start having the meetings with the necessary legislators and also filing the proper paperwork. Have we looked at what that deadline is before I think just the complexity of how much we put on there, the timeline is why I want to kind of, work backwards. Do we have a date on what our deadline would be for an approved? Because before you're starting to ask for appropriations,
Right.
I think we have to
Want
agree to that.
Backwards up the calendar. While you're looking at that, I just wanted to also add in, if I may, Madam Chair, of continuing our high caliber focus on safety and security, but I will be deferring to our national expert, who I know will bring up that piece.
I have it circled with the name on it. So we have meeting October 3rd, October 17th. Realistically, the 17th going to put us back? It's very tight, but.
It would put it tight, but the local delegation has a meeting at the end of October. So having it by the 17th is almost imperative.
Okay,
So that
so-
we could take it to them at that point and start at the local level, while Capital City is also assisting with that in Tallahassee and getting the appropriations requests taken care of.
Okay, so for the sake of conversation, October 17th being the latest, pending what we talk about today, and if there's additional time needed, if not, we can try to put it on a earlier agenda. Does that sound reasonable? Okay. The logistics are now out of the way. Do you have any comments, Mrs. Marinelli?
I just, I agree with everything that you stated, Madam Chair, and what Ms. Rose. I feel very strongly, too, about the pre-K, because we start them early, and then we finish with our CTE and everything, so that covers the broad brush, sorry. I knew not to press the buzzer, so. So, anyway, I agree. I just had, if I may, if we, on the one with the pre-K opportunities, modify school readiness preschool application to fund wraparound services for pre-K, what would that look like? What are we talking about?
Thank you for that question.
Anybody?
Well, no, I agree.
Superintendent?
So on the application, it's only going to cover, dependent upon income, what it's going to be able to allow for in terms of coverage for that. So what we're asking for is beyond just the 3 hours that they would be provided by the state, is to fund beyond that aftercare component. So it was just a modification of the application to ensure that there is the ability, if parents choose, to have those additional services, that they can get funding for that.
So that's what you mean by the wraparound, having the 3 extra hours?
Beyond, so we would do a full, what we're asking for,
Because it's half day now, we want to do a full day.
Right.
Which I agree with.
Right.
I was just looking for clarification what that meant.
Around.
Yeah.
Wraparound.
wraparound usually is that, if I work until 6 o'clock and the day ends at 3 o'clock, those additional hours beyond the full day, let's just say we were able to get full day funding for VPK, anything above and beyond that would be considered wraparound services.
Like childcare.
Childcare. there, yes.
And
All right.
good, that's a great question. Thank you for that. From a granular standpoint, there may be additional nuances that perhaps we have, again, with agreement with the board, we have a board member kind of lead that so the nuances are in the right posture as we move forward. But my question around pre-K, because I know it's priority, can benefit, so I'm not opposed for this being on there. What's the current status with transportation for pre-K? Although that's so little, I can't even imagine. What do we do? Yeah, okay, I can't, I'm a little, okay. The thing is any kind of service we have, if there's no transportation, I call them schools on the moon. It doesn't make it necessarily accessible. So I don't know about putting them on a bus, but I don't know what solutions we may have, but that may be a topic for another day. Mr. Edwards.
Thank you. Pre-K is certainly a priority for me. What's interesting is I sat in with the consortium, and it's the legislative agenda that you presented, that you say that you worked with capital cities, they're almost identical. So what's interesting to me from how we prepare our asks is last year, I don't know if you remember, but the consortium, FSBA, and our local, we asked for increase in bus transportation allocation, and that did come through. And so I think it's important that we try to prioritize those three agendas correctly, because I think a lot of this is statewide. And when it's statewide, it has more clout at Tallahassee when they have to do appropriations and allocations. So that would be just my overall suggestion as we talk through these things, pre-K and continuing education. I think one of the ones that I know that would be easy to get are those background checks for teachers and for bus drivers. And I think that's going statewide, and it's not a hard ask. So I think that's important. Obviously, the school safety allocation increase. One that no one brought up, but I think it's an important one. It is on the consortium, because almost everyone in the consortium are coastal school districts, is our property insurance. We should have a categorical for property insurance, and it's, and I've said this before from the dais, this year particularly, we have an increase in cost, and we have an increase in risk and less coverage. So I think that's an important piece from an operational standpoint that we should consider.
Thank you. I personally, I think we'll go around as we kind of list these all out, because I want to make sure everyone's on the same page. I think for any legislative platform, it makes sense that we're all in agreement so we can all go out and support and lobby it. The background checks, I wrote that down as one of the things I think are would be a great opportunity, and realize that that is an impediment. I think when we ask for funding, it's really helpful to be very narrowly, to the most part, narrowly tailored. I think everyone's asking for funding, but we explain what it's for. I know I always talk about fully funding as I tweak when just because I think that the legislators hear that all the time, and so they gloss over and maybe not think about the real impact of what we're asking for. And I love the background checks. I don't know if are we just broadly saying that, but if we're able to put anecdotally a story behind it from a financial standpoint, if we think about how much that costs and how much, I know Jody deals with it all the time. So, Mr. Enos.
Yeah, thank you, Madam Chair. I also am in agreement with the pre-K. I think everybody brought it up, especially on the wraparound service. I know we talked about that and the implication. Obviously, I'm going to keep pushing to have EPK at every elementary school over the summer to be able to provide that even outside of the normal pre-K that we had to model at GO-SHOW. I know that we talk about that. I also like that. I think that's an easy push for the background checks. I think that's something to go off. I definitely know from my son just graduating 2 years ago, the STC piece on the local appropriations, I think that is huge. A lot of our kids are not going in there, and I know how much it costs now in order to have an HVAC guy come out to your house. Thank you, Mr. DePillo, for Oh, no, that's not your pricing, I'm sorry. But at the end of the day, I know that we need people in those positions, and obviously, we're talking about Northport and expansion down there, and I know that with Mr. Edwards and a lot of the stuff that's going on, I think that's also that goes into our priorities. The Holocaust education, I know that they've been giving tours. I'm going to be going out there to do the tour of the Federation site, the old JCC. I'm 100% in favor. I'd also add in, too, we had the long conversation on healthcare. I know that's kind of a pie-in-the-sky push, but maybe as a state, even though it is here as a statewide, I know we talked about the healthcare costs that we went up by, what was it, 19% or significant. I would think that ultimately, again, for our employees, I think that that's something, I mean, I know from after I retired, I think my health insurance was somewhere around $1,300 a month. So I think that ultimately, when you start looking at paying teachers and all that, I think that most that we can do at the beginning, for especially in the healthcare. The last thing I'll talk about is on the school safety. I know that this is overall as a statewide priority. I know that the state just came up with, instead of the CSTAG, which was the Dewey Cornell model, the Marjorie Stoneman Douglas Commission just created a whole new threat assessment and that mental health component. I know that the staff here, I saw Michael Stanagata yesterday and his team, that they're working on it. They've been trained. Now they're training the trainers. They're trying to implement it. I know there's a lot of time because it's new with the counselors, and ultimately, if we can do that for the push where DOE is asking for more money, that ultimately will help us on the bottom side, because right now I believe that the state only has 2 trainers that are going out, including one of them is the sheriff from Pinellas County. So this is one of their mandates that obviously is mandatory. So I would also say in that, one of the other thing that's talked about a lot is in reference to the Guardian program and having additional officers at school. I don't think that we need to do that, but what I would say if it gets down to it is that I would ask for funding. The state still doesn't statutorily require a law enforcement officer on every campus. Obviously, I'm a huge advocate of that over and above, what it should be. But I would just say is if the state is really, really, if they're super concerned about safety, then they need to provide more funding so that it can help district, because you start looking about the allocations that we have to pay outside of the safe schools money that we get, it's still significant. So again, that would be something, I don't know if it needs to be priority as reference to that because that's not a local thing, but statewide, as the MSD Commission and they're making the changes through the Office of Safe Schools for DOE, it would be something that, depending on where it goes going forward as they continue to make legislative changes, is that as they're making those changes, is the schools should ask for more money because they're making the requirement, but they need to fund it. And I know for a lot of it, they didn't fund it. They didn't fund the Safe School signs. They didn't fund the Safe Corner signs. They didn't fund, that was all something that every school district had to incur the cost of. And we're just lucky in Sarasota that, we are financially able to do that. So if it does push to that and we hear anything with the legislative group, in reference to SRO funding, Guardian funding, I definitely like to increase mental health on the threat assessment because that is a brand new program that Florida created for itself, as well as we talk about all the counselors and when they're doing that, are they able to do other work within their schools while they're doing this? So hopefully that will give us more training and more, which ultimately should make it smoother and easier transition. So I know I said a lot, but.
But no, you brought up a lot of good stuff. I have a question on the mental health allocation. Where is it?
First,
Mental health allocation, no.
under teacher retention.
Where did it go?
There's 2 of them, increased mental health allocation.
It was about being able to utilize it. I'm sorry, I just don't also.
That's on,
For the bonus.
That was on the teacher retention and recruitment slide, authorizing school
Thank you.
districts to
Authorize
use.
school districts to use mental health assistance allocation to fund school counselor, school social worker, and nurse bonuses. So that is not eligible at this current.
That is not an eligible expense at the
And
moment.
are you saying, based on even on the safety side, that would be something?
Yes, that's a
That-
priority.
Agree.
from what I've been able to ascertain by asking questions, this new protocol will take, because right now the counselors basically do those, it's going to take over 3 hours to just even start it. And then it's a continuation. So when you add that, we're all getting emails from parents who are not happy that their child or children are not getting the traditional counseling services, especially high school with transcripts, college, everything. So we get more and more mandates, and there's no funding or positions. So that's going to be a tremendous amount of time on our school counselors to be able to complete this, plus collaborate with other staff members and law enforcement. And I mean, we know that it's a priority, the safety of our schools, but how much more is going to be put on in a 6-hour day or a 6.5-hour day? So it's like, where is this balance for all of this? And all these unfunded mandates it's just like, do it, and then the districts and the schools have to come out with how to do it with limited.
And I want
staff.
the superintendent, I mean, just if you could chime in, because I think a lot of these come from, and I say that they come from good intentions, is trying to have the legislators meet with the superintendent or different staff so they understand the operational implication. So that would be kind of my question of,
Well, when I'm pretty direct, as most people know. I've asked our legislative, and I do it very respectfully, but I've asked them, do you understand the unintentional consequences with some of your legislative decisions? And I have to say, I kind of get a blank look. So then they ask for more information, and I talk to them about it, and they're like, oh, we had no idea. I said, yeah, it all sounds good, but how do you want it implemented? So I think those positive dialogues, especially with our superintendent leading that, will carry a lot of weight.
so and then
Yeah.
it was, yeah.
So great segue to something I wanted to share with the board. We're working on a delegation meeting, and I don't know if that's how that's happened in Sarasota County before. So what we're working and shooting for an October 26th. We're firming up that date, firming up the people, and inviting you guys, this team here, to meet with our local delegation to have this dialogue. It will be good by that time too to have a firmed up legislative platform that we can also, anchor our conversations in, and then talk about those aspects that they may not be aware of as they go into legislation and they start to advocate for some of these things. Because to Ms. Marinelli's point, with school safety, providing additional resource for district threat management teams goes right to that, knowing that it is it's going to be a monumental task in terms of the new protocol, the new Florida model, which superintendents were trained on last week. And it is extensive, and it's going to be an extra layer on our schools. So having additional resources and advocating for that now, I think, is important. Just to switch gears a little bit too.
Well, before you do that, Mr. Edwards, did you have a comment on that particular one?
Thank you. I think that the way that this is worded, authorize school districts to use mental health assistant allocation to fund counselor, school social worker, and nurse. I like that because it creates a wider net. And if what I like so much about the conversation is that I know all of us worked very hard on certain increases in our budgets, counselors, pre-K, those kinds of things are reflective here. And when you are less specific but create a bigger bucket, I think you have a greater shot of getting money, and then we can decide how to do it. So for example, our college career centers, I don't know how much of this has really transpired yet, but I remember that when they were coming back to our organization, that some of the work that counselors would do could be shifted to the College Career Center, taking some of that burden off of them and freeing them up to do more counseling and more of that kind of work. So I don't know that that's the point of today's conversation, but the idea is to get as much money as we possibly can and then figure out how we solve those problems.
Agreed. I think, and I'm glad to hear about the 10-20-60. I think that's the part that oftentimes, and and it's not ill-intended. I think that there's big picture problems, concerns, and then the implementation pieces sometimes not connected. So I think that'll be very helpful. And I'm sorry, you wanted to segue somewhere else?
Well, just reading the tea leaves in terms of where we see the legislature going and what the focus will be this year, deregulation, because of HB1 and the passage of that last session, and now that the dollars follow the student, whether that's private, charter, wherever they decide, homeschool, that there is going to be, it seems, there's going to be a big push around deregulation, and that will be helpful for traditional public schools because, again, unfunded mandates and the time-consuming task as it relates to what's on. I think there are 8,500 shalls in the legislations right now for traditional public schools, 8,500. I think 20 years ago it was 5,500. So just in 20 years, 3,000 additional shalls have been placed on traditional public schools. So this is something that I think is going to be a big focus for the legislator going in, and I think we need to be on that in the front, out front leading that charge, because that may help us with some of the other priorities as well.
Yeah, go ahead. Sorry, more casual.
Sorry.
It's all good.
How would you, I think that's amazing, and that's a breath of fresh air, quite honestly, as it relates to public education. But how would we find out what our priorities are? Because there are so many shalls that are lost in our day-to-day for administrators and principals and teachers. How can we find out the low-hanging fruit, common denominators, and get that information quickly? Because if you're reading those tea leaves correctly, I'd love to have the top 10 from Sarasota on a list.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think what we can do, we can go back and actually work with our teams to maybe prioritize what is the most burdensome things that are on us right now that we can share with the DOE, who can obviously advocate on our behalf as well. Because this is, I think, statewide, every district is compiling these shalls and at least providing that feedback for the legislators to see how can we begin the process of deregulation. So I'll be glad to have our team take a look at what are the top 10 or 20 things that are really clogging the pipeline for us.
Would you share that with the board sooner
Absolutely.
than our next workshop or meeting so that we have that information sooner than
Absolutely.
later?
Yes, sir.
Thank you.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think that could be very fruitful. Again, with any of these, I think it's really important we have being very strategic of numbers, examples, outcomes, or unforeseen outcomes or consequences, especially if we're lining it up with appropriations. So, I mean, two separate issues, but going in with, we understand why this was done, but oh, by the way, and that's all the finesse of the lobbying process. But
I just wanted to say something very positive, that I'm very glad that we're having this conversation, and my hope is that, others have been included in this, but I feel very strongly with Superintendent Connor and our chair, Bridget Ziegler, working together on all of our behalves, that this is a new positive step in the right direction of working with the delegates and getting things done. So I'm very encouraged, because for me, and in all the years that I worked here, I haven't seen this before. Not to say it hadn't happened, but not in my 35 years of this collaborative. So I'm really looking forward to, and I think we might see some great achievements for our school.
that's the
district. So
hope.
thank
Yeah, no, I agree. And I think, again, there's a lot we agree on. Well, maybe people just find that there's like to focus on where we don't, but there is a lot, even when we're talking about legislative priorities, so, which is a good thing. I do wanted to, and then we'll kind of recap on this, but I want to, when it comes to the CTE piece, there's two other areas, actually, I shouldn't say. The one area that that Sarasota County Schools has led on, and because it includes federal government, who knows when it will happen, but I would hate for it to drop off, and it comes down to the recruitment aspect and not the retirement, being able to bring back retired educators, truly, because it's an IRS regulation that ultimately there's no rule on it. It's, if you go this route, we could be exposing the FRS, and we won't know until after we get dinged. So but I do think us highlighting how important it is, and we really did start that conversation, I think, for the state. So I think if that's agreeable for everyone to keep that on the legislative platform, because I don't go by the wayside, because I think it should still continuously be raised, particularly as we talk about the teacher shortage and all the wonderful institutional knowledge they have. And then the other one was on our CTE. So again, an area I think that I know that Sarasota's led on for almost a decade or plus is on our technical education, and really putting that at the forefront, even from a legislative platform. There's a lot on here, though, so we have to figure out where do we want. I know there's been, and I know Dr. DePillo's here, so if acceptable.
So, yeah, I asked Dr. DePillo to be up here to answer. I know you had mentioned specifically about the farm project as
Yeah.
proper appropriation for that.
Yeah.
So do you just want to maybe speak to the status and maybe where we could?
There's a couple, one thing is when Chris and Parento and I met and discussed, we really focused on the legislative type priorities, not the appropriations. And so when we came to that, you'll see there's continue to on because last year we almost achieved everything we asked for in career technical education. And that's because of what Mr. Edwards spoke of. We had a multi-prong approach, and we had other agencies involved in advocating the exact same language up to Tallahassee, and that across everybody's desk was the same language. So I would encourage you, share them with the early childhood coalitions, the chambers and the EDCs, and that's where we landed.
Yep.
And so we had a multi-prong approach, which was very successful. We still have three main capital projects. One is the farm, one is the fire academy at the new training facility at the county, and the last one would be the expansion of Northport and where we end up with that. Those are our three main big ask for capital dollars. The farm project has grown over time in terms of cost, but not necessarily scope. We have phased that project. There is a shortage. That number keeps moving. Every day it gets larger and further outside, and we keep trimming back services. But yet we're at a point now where we're moving forward with, on your agenda for October, I believe you're going to see a change order for us to get started on the first phase. So we took the money that was available and created phase one, and then we have to come back to phase two at some other time. I don't have that exact number. Again, it's moving. But I'm expecting that we could be very successful with the work we've done already in the community with the farm and ag people. That Tripp Jennings has done a great job in advocating for that, and I think there is some opportunity for private-public partnership to get that done.
If I may, I think it's just a unique project that'll stand out from the state level, and I think when you consider industry-wise, next to hospitality, ag is number two, I think it still is.
Ag seems to get very special privileges from the state in terms of a lot of different avenues that we take in terms of,
I think,
it's big.
again, if what that number is, and perhaps we kind of I would say for today, we would have the priorities outlined, and then if you can just work with us and figure out what that number looks like, so that's provided to us, then we can adopt it. Mr. Edwards.
Yes, I just want to keep everybody on the loop of what's happening at the Northport project. We met with the hospital last week, and we should know within the next week or two their potential contribution into that project. Northport made a commitment that day also that they would let us know in short order what their contribution would be into that project. We're talking to the county now about the SRQ resilience piece that came, there's I think $15 million in workforce training available in that particular piece. There's also potentially some county money that would be available, and then we would have a balance ask, after our contribution, we'd have a balance ask that we'd like to add to this program to Tallahassee. What we're being told, and certainly meeting with our representatives locally and including them into that particular piece of the project, is that, to your point, it's a win, 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 win for so many pieces of our community and the hospital and the school district, our students, their families. I mean, so it just keeps going, and hopefully we can get in under that deadline
That's what I was just
here
gonna
in the
ask.
conversation, and the superintendent would make sure that any information that we get, you'll get as quickly as possible.
So do we think we'll hit the deadline based on that?
That's my plan.
Okay. And do we have any idea how much we're thinking? Like,
I have no.
any ballpark? Okay.
It's too soon to.
So so that we don't knock them over by asking for $25 million, but I mean, if we have a strategy, I'm not opposed to it. So if we could go through, we have pre-K, Holocaust, background checks. I know we didn't talk about insurance. I have some thoughts, but then, at least from what we just talked about, then the safety/mental health, and then CTE, broadly speaking. I don't disregard the insurance at all. I think that it's a very clogged, challenging system. Whether we put it on our legislative platform, my personal thought is that it doesn't go by the wayside of not discussing the issue of it, but including it on a specific platform, I would be hesitant to, unless we have I would just need to understand what the financials are, because each one's different, insured differently, honestly, as far as a loss-sensitive program. Some retain more risk, some have the financials to do that, some, so there's a lot of nuances there, but I don't think it's a bad idea to bring up the concerns, both on just the financial impact that has. I just don't know that there's a clear solution for it that even the state can fund. That's just my personal feedback. But outside of that, and again, does anyone have any comments on that? I don't want to just throw it out. So is there anything I'm missing? Pre-K, Holocaust, background checks, safety/the mental health threat assessment, which I'm sure will finesse the language there, and then CTE. And the programs are the Northport project, and I think we would call it the triple P kind of, or multi. I know we did that before, but with the various municipalities, the farm project, and then he went away. The fire. Would we be asking? Are you thinking the fire? We got money allocated for that last. I'm sorry. You left too soon. So the fire. Can you talk to that? Because we did get money last year, and I think again.
So apparently, just like every other project that's happening across the state of Florida, the budgets have grown.
Yeah.
We had committed a dollar amount, and that was our commitment, but then the project grew over time. I don't know for sure, but I think there's a shortage in the project at the county level, and they were going to come and ask. I don't know if they've had those meetings or not, but there may be a need for additional funds. We have not committed any additional funds. We have the $5 million that we committed and the $1 million that we got for the appropriation.
And the additional request would be for another $5 million.
And then Mr. Edwards made a good point, because this is not just locally, it's a regional attraction. And so have we, and some of the counties I consider, I mean, just so I don't know if they have the financial means to, but is that?
So I think there's other contributors. Is the city of Venice was a contributor. I'm not sure about any others for sure. That would be something that Mr. Collins, Rich Collins, could kind of chime in on about his project. Remember, we're contributing to the big project. We don't have any vendors or anything else involved other than the contribution, and then the input into what the design is for our facility as the academy.
Okay. Well, so there's some, under CTE, I guess we'll come back with some ideas between, because that's a lot of different dollars, and we've already expended on kind of both of them. Again, I have not had any additional conversations about the.
I didn't put it on our priority list. Those are the three projects that we are working on. And so in terms of priority, it would be your decision to which ones to prioritize. And we're okay with, moving forward with any direction. We're going to still try to seek money, either as a non-priority of the district, but we'll try to seek it through other partnerships, if possible, to help fund it. But that's really a county project, and they're really kind of coordinating that whole thing.
Gotcha. Thank you for that final note. Mrs. Rose, and then Mr. Edwards. I see them nodding.
Teacher compensation, increase in student allocation, and total FEFP as just funding under the funding category. If it's the purview of the board, it's recommendation of mine.
The first line.
It's right up at the top.
To maintain. And I like the lining, request.
Oh, no, this document.
Which one?
This document here.
I got too many papers over here. Yeah, I think that doesn't hurt. I always say fully fund is the worst, but that doesn't say fully fund, so, because I really don't think it will get anywhere, so. But certainly highlighting the insignificance of teacher compensation.
Yeah, just to add to that point, there's been a lot on the new beginning teacher salaries.
Yeah.
And I think there is opportunity for us to advocate around that middle career, late career veterans. As we begin to push those salaries up, so you're seeing compression starting to hit those middle years. And so that may be an opportunity to advocate on that if we want to get specific
Yeah.
around funding.
No, and I think looking at some other districts, how they've done, because the legislative session changes or certain things come up, I think giving guidance to our lobbyist and certainly having specific projects for Sarasota, we can illustrate the financial impact that we need. We can, all of those variables that we talked about, but then having pillars, overarching priorities that we give some leeway. Again, I think checking back in with all of us to make sure we're on the same page, but having something like teacher compensation included in there, that when they're up in Tallahassee, knowing that that is a priority, talking about teacher pay, early beginning teachers, et cetera, and compression, without having explicit and too detailed. I think the county does a really good job, something similarly to that, that we could, if we haven't done that before as a board, but I see it working elsewhere, and I think based on that, a couple different ones here that I think that might make sense. Does that sound workable with your experience?
Absolutely. And in talking with Capital City, a lot of these other areas also fall under funding. So, the way that we can be more specific and show what we're asking for, why we're asking for it, and how we're planning to utilize it is going to be a benefit to us.
Okay. Yeah, so if we can draft, do you have enough direction? Are there any additional?
I agree with, teacher compensation. I think your pinpoint of mid-range compression is where to focus, because the last few years, I think, have been focused on entry level, and we keep getting deeper in trouble in that area. And I don't think it's only Sarasota. I think it's around the state, and that might have more clout. And Mr. DiPillo did answer my question of the fire is a county project, and I think it's better left if we were prioritizing on their plate.
Okay. Good stuff. Are there any outstanding, Mrs. Rose?
Safety and security, I feel like we have continually increased cost in that area to just maintain best practices. And I know that Mr. Enos reflected on a couple pieces. I think I would like to encourage us to, as the superintendent had pinpoint an area that perhaps is common within the state, and Mr. Enos reflected on that. I feel to keep up with that piece, I mean, everything that we've talked about on that list is encompassed in that we can ensure the safest best practices. So I'm taking us back to, do we want to be specific with a peace and safety security? I mean, we add, and I'm in agreement with all of our adds, but at what point do we focus on the state participating in that funding?
Well, I know that the commission still is ultimately what's driving the ship in reference to the mandates. And I know that they're still meeting, and they're meeting, I believe, they're meeting quarterly now. I know their last big push was this mental health assessment. I know that, the threat assessment piece, I believe that they're going to provide, and I know Mr. Connor was there, I believe they're going to provide the mobile platform is supposed to be available, January?
January, yep.
So that's supposed
2025, I believe, not January 24.
Oh, not 24, so we're still, okay. So, and I know they're still making some other things in reference to safety and security. I mean, at this point, obviously, any additional dollars that we can get for safe schools in order to offset the cost of SROs training and/or security monitors in order to bolster security and safety. I mean, they still have the guidelines in regards to single-point entry and fencing. I know here we had to add egresses in something that we had found. I know that we're looking at doing AI type of stuff, which ultimately that has a cost associated with it. So it's kind of a pretty broad thing, but ultimately, anything they can provide us with additional safe schools monies will offset the costs that will come out as we generate as we move forward. If that answers the question. It's kind of hard to be specific in it because they're still making broad broad swipes at trying to do it. But their main focus right now is the threat assessment that they've changed from the Virginia model to the new state model.
Tom?
The consortium ask for that is to increase safe schools categorical allocation by at least $100 million to narrow the funding gap associated with the mandate of staff one safe school officer per school and ensure sustainable funding for school districts. So that is asking for the big bucket to increase by $100 million, and then it comes back to us to decide how our allocation would be spent.
And that's kind of what I was saying, is it has to go for the bigger picture to funnel it down to the
Right.
bottom.
Well, I think it should be absolutely like a priority pillar of discussion, on no doubt, and I think we all agree on that. It's interesting when we talk about at the state level because disparities are huge. I mean, when Mr. Enos talks about us being the leader, I mean, it is unequivocal that we are leaps and bounds ahead of other districts. One, because we were funding it earlier, even before Marjorie Stoneman Douglas, but so we had a leg up. But also we have more funding in a variety of ways, and we're just better. I mean, we just are in a better position. So it is interesting when we talk about increasing that massive lump. I know it gets allocated. I think it's a priority. I don't know what the answer is to your point of like what narrowly could we say, because I worry we put ourselves in, well, how could Sarasota ask for more when they have all of this stuff, but then look at this county over here? And that's my only hesitation. But I think as a leading district, we should absolutely maintain the security funding and prioritization. Does that sound like a reasonable solution, or is there some, I mean, I think the mental health piece is, I mean, or the threat assessment.
I think the overall increase to the safe schools allocation allows us to pinpoint our specific needs here. So I think the more we continue just to say, listen, we want to go 100 million, and we want to advocate for what the Florida Department of Education, do we have that number, Chris, in terms of what?
Yeah, I think that was
the
on.
DOE was advocating for safe schools?
Safe schools was 40 million, was the
40.
request from the
That's in
DOE.
If we
alignment
wanted to
with
fall in
DOE's
between 40 and 100 or go above that, we could do that. But I think by prioritizing the safe schools allocation increase, that allows us to then utilize, to Mr. Enos's point.
So if I may make a suggestion, can we create maybe pillars like early education, funding, very similar to how you have this out, safety, special projects, which would be Holocaust, some of the CTE, whether those blend, I'm not sure. Then bring that back to the board members so that we can all provide the superintendent our feedback, so that, again, I really do believe, and if we and I'm not opposed to this, by the way, if there's something that just someone's not comfortable with the language, we just strike it, because I think that it's far more important to have it align up with everyone's agreement than it not be fully supported. Does that make sense?
Yep.
Is everyone okay with that? Mrs. Rose?
Relative to pre-K, I would like to see us get specific with dollars and what those dollars would be allocated for.
I would agree, and I'm fine with presenting or either working with Mr. Connor or what have you, so that we can do that. I don't know, I could certainly come up with those numbers, but if you are able to support that, I think the more we're able to provide specifics in those areas is the better for us.
Yeah, I agree that we should be getting more specific in a plan, not just what we're asking for, but it could dovetail into our plan for next year as well. Because I know we increased by 6 classrooms in this budget, but that was just because I quickly asked how much capacity do we have available, and the answer was 6, and so we went with it. But what is the plan for advanced pre-K? And from my seat, I'm really looking for that 8-hour classroom, not a VPK, but utilizing the VPK funding to offset the cost of 8 hours. But that's, again, I don't want to get too specific here, but those two asks and the plan should come kind of close.
Yeah. I agree on all of them. I think we've talked about that before as far as the strategic plan, the budget process, our legislative platform, all kind of being a whole life cycle, so that there's relevance to the ask, and then we can illustrate, oh, by the way, we were able to achieve X. So then when we go back again, they know that we're utilizing it in a strategic way. So, and I think if we can make it in a one-pager, the better. And are there any other, so you'll be able to take, are there any outstanding items you need clarification on?
What I will say about pre-K too, I think an ask that will resonate around the state too is just to start with full-day VPK programs. If we start there as a district, that we can get more specific in terms of budgets and, buying the furniture, buying the curriculum, paying for the teachers. But we have to have starting money first. And I think the request needs to be go from half day to full day. That would be a big help in getting to this plan that we will eventually get to in terms of pre-K services in Sarasota.
Exactly, well, yeah, and exactly, and we say where we are and what that deficit looks like, correct? Okay, perfect. Any outstanding thoughts, questions, concerns? Wonderful. All right, so I think we've got that one done, and we have our timeline. So that's the latest is October 17th, but if there aren't any objections, we can get it adopted beforehand and advertised beforehand, the better. Yes? Okay. All
So
right.
that would be October 3rd.
That's correct, if possible. Again, not sloppy,
Yep.
but if everyone's on the same page, then earlier the better. Moving on I got way too many papers and I didn't have them very organized here. Moving on to the next item is policy updates.
All right, so we'll continue with Mr. Parento related to policy developments.
And I'm going to ask Mr. Duggan to come up here as well because he played a part in a lot of these revisions and also what the actual ask is here today. In talking with him, there is a statutory process, obviously, that we have to follow, which includes coming to the board in a workshop like this, asking for permission to publicly notice the development of new policies or changes to current policies. That's a 14-day noticing that we have to do. After that, we can provide the first draft in a board meeting setting for the public, and that would then have to be out there publicly noticed as well for 28 days, and then it would be able to be voted on by the board to adopt and become the new policy, which is why you'll see in here a lot of policies that we're asking for permission to begin that process. Some of them are ready, some of them are not, but we just want to get out ahead of this as we start to make sure that our policies are in alignment with DOE rules and with state statutes. And Mr. Duggan has assisted in different departments throughout the district. We've been working together hand in hand to make sure that policies that need immediate attention are getting that immediate attention from the start. And I believe that Ms. Penner is here on the first one, which is the Financial Advisory Committee. This was discussed in a workshop back in April earlier this year. The policy is drafted to provide transparency into the construction, the roles and responsibilities of the Financial Advisory Committee. It's drafted to closely mirror the Audit Committee's policy, and it's needed based on the ballot language for the millage, which was discussed in that workshop back in April. So with these, I think it's probably best if we just go one by one. That way, if the board has any questions, those can be asked, addressed, and answered. So if the board has any questions, I believe Ms. Penner's here to answer those.
I just want to make a comment on the overview. I very much appreciate this, especially when there's a multitude of policies, giving the overview, giving a narrative overview. Obviously, there is our responsibility on the nuances. We mentioned shall before. Those are where we do have to get into granular, but from a workshop standpoint, there have been some painstaking workshops where we're reading through that, so I very much appreciate this process. Were there any comments on the first policy?
I want to reinforce what you just
Oh, I was like,
a huge, huge improvement. I thank the superintendent and certainly respect and appreciate your new position as,
you have no idea how excited. And I don't take it lightly that this is truly our, and I don't want that to be misinterpreted by any member of the public, that we're offsetting our very, very important responsibility when it comes to policy, but the process, because there is a requirement on the implementation and the administrative side that has not been in effect, I swear, since I've been here, and that feels like forever. So this is, thank you.
reinforcing that as well.
So I'm sorry, you want the Financial Advisory Committee, that policy?
Yes, so that's one that obviously is ready to go once we would have permission, and we can kind of discuss that later on, or we could do them one by one, that we just need to get that one noticed and advertised and ready to go so that it is in place when it's needed based on Ms. Penner's needs.
Perfect. Thank you, Mrs. Penner. I know we talked about this before. I have no comments. If the board members have anyone, I know we wanted to mirror up, so there was continuity with some other committees, but also particularly on the ballot language. So I have no comments. Are there any other? Moving on.
Perfect. Moving on, the next is a cluster of policies that all involve electronic devices, social media, and new guidance from the Department of Education, banning the use or access of TikTok, any successor platform, and any other applications that are on the prohibited list from the Florida Department of Management Services from use or access on district devices or district internet connections. Each of those policies listed there on the left side have been updated with that language, while also providing exceptions for designated district personnel and law enforcement through the course of an investigation if needed, which is allowed by law. So each of those policies has been updated. There also is a recommendation. You'll see we have two different policies that are 6.322, just to change the numbering of the staff social media guidelines to 6.233. That way there's no confusion as anybody references one of those policies moving forward, that it'll be known which one they're referencing.
I see no comments or fingers. Okay. That sounds, anyone flagging wanting to speak? No. So just to confirm, we're striking one policy and consolidating, so there's continuity. Is that correct?
No, we would keep both policies because they are separate and they each relate to different things. The staff social media guidelines and district-related social media accounts. So it would just be changing the policy number of the staff social media guidelines to 6.323.
I see here. Got you. Those were close numbers. Okay. Sorry. No comments? Okay. We can move on.
The next policy is another one that is just being updated out of changes at the state level for drop. Those revisions are based on SB 7024, extending the maximum time and drop from 60 months to 96 months and changing the amount of time that certain instructional employees have the opportunity to extend to 24 months. That previously was 36 months, but it ends up being 10 years total now, not 8, because of those initial changes from 60 months to 96. So this is just a revision of our policy to be in line with the state law.
Any comments? Mrs. Rose?
A win-win. It allows us to keep staff that are experienced and contributing, and also gives them an opportunity to work longer. So it's positive. I'm thanking the
She likes to highlight the win-wins, which good. That works.
reinforcing them, Mrs. Ziegler, to
That works.
continue to grow.
It works for me. Are there any comments on 5.70? Questions? Okay.
The next policy is another one just aligning with the Florida Department of Education rule on transfer of student records. It allows 5 days to comply with students transferring, to transfer those records instead of 3 days. So updating that and adding the superintendent's designee option for who's responsible for reviewing online educational services. It's another one that rule provides for that allowance.
Okie dokie. Are there any? I see no comments. Can keep rolling through.
Perfect. The next rule is 2.70, bullying and harassment. This rule was discussed collectively with legal, HR, and student services, updating the language to cover employees as protected from bullying and harassment. Previously, the policy only covered students. Provides additional protected classification terminology for state and federal compliance. Updates to include persons being aware of bullying or harassment as required to report the incident to school or district administrators. Allows for immediate temporary action if necessary to stop the alleged conduct during the course of the investigation. and requires parent or guardian notification as soon as possible for both victims and perpetrators of violation claims, updating the assessor definitions to match the latest guidance, and adding details about the HOPE scholarship program eligibility to the end of that policy.
Can I ask a quick question? So there's a double-edged sword of using language like reasonable, as soon as possible, for good reason. And I'm looking at our general counsel here, and actually, Mr. Enos, I'd love your feedback from your experience. But when in this particular instance, saying as soon as possible, again, there's always a good faith argument. If you can illustrate that someone was working in bad faith, then therefore, I think that if I'm interpreting that right. So is it best to keep it is as soon as possible the statute change? And I'm sorry if I didn't think of it until you said it out
We
loud.
actually, it's a good question. We actually had this conversation.
Oh.
I think
only
in
asked.
one of the draft iterations, it was within 24 hours. And I think when you have a time certain, that can be mechanical and sometimes
Sloppy.
can be applicable, and sometimes it is not as soon as possible. So, like for example, if you become aware of something at 9 in the morning, on a school day, on a Tuesday, and you have access to the phones, that's different if you become aware of something on a Friday at 8 p.m. perhaps, right? 24 hours in the first scenario, if you called the parents the next day is probably not appropriate. There's probably a scenario where if you contacted the parents for something on a Friday night, first thing Monday morning, it would be appropriate. So I think having as soon as possible takes into consideration the variables that can come up when we're dealing with different kids under different circumstances, different times of the day, with all of the different schools and locations that we have. I think that sends the message that it needs to happen promptly, but doesn't tie our hands to a mechanical definition that can either be too slow or not meeting the needs of the families that we have.
And I appreciate, Mr. Dugan, I appreciate your comment as the person that actually created the checklist of the bullying procedures at the district. I would say I take two exceptions in here based upon if you look at the national standards and you look at stuff. One of the things is, I think the investigation, if you have 10 business days, which is what they're saying, I think 15 days is too long. Originally, we came.
We're at 2.7.
2.0.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, so it's on page 7.
Okay.
Paragraph F.
Thank
I know
you.
we originally came up with the 10 days, which was 2 full weeks of school. And the other piece, I'd say that as soon as possible, the reason we put that in there is that one of the biggest pieces in all of the bullying stuff is the immediate notification of the parent of the student who is being bullied, so that they can get appropriate mental health and counseling and be able to take appropriate action. That if you put in there that it could be the next day, who's to say that now that has been reported, that the bullying knows it's been reported, and this was part of the rule why we did it in the same day, as in if it happened at 4 o'clock, you still have the requirement you need to make sure you contact the parent. And the reason being is that the bully could ultimately cause significant distress that night without the parent being notified. And so that is part of the reasons why initially that we came up with that, so that it was a ironclad that with the check sheet that we had created, which I believe it still exists out there, that notification was all part of the policy of the school administrator to notify the parent as well as the parent of the bully in reference to the investigation and the complaint, that being that the parent then can intervene because a lot of the kids who are being bullied don't talk to their parents about it. Thus, then that parent can intervene in case there's any other immediacy or immediate actions that need to happen. So that was the only reason why it was within that 1-day period. And I'm more okay with the 15 days. I'm not as okay with as soon as possible, because without that standard, it could be, okay, I try the phone and then I call the next day, but then I get busy and then
Is
I
it
call
like
the next
as
day.
soon as possible, but no less or no more than X? I mean, because this is where I challenge ourselves, because that's the reason. Again, there's a different severity. There's this, in a perfect world, we're thinking common sense. Everyone's doing good faith. We have to manage. I mean, we have to then hold the administrator accountable for managing staff with the highest expectations. But so I don't know how prescriptive we get. So you're saying as soon as possible, we should not keep.
No, I think it should be within the day, as in that, I mean, I could tell you that 75% of all school shooters were bullied. I could tell you that, the suicide rate is based upon bullying. I could tell you that cyberbullying is ultimately rampant all over the place. And that is where the worst of the worst is in the reference to the mental health, which ultimately and it would say that if it affects the educational process of the school, even if it was off-site, then administrators would be able to intervene. So I would just say in reference to that, I would just keep it in that same posture, is that because if that's so significant in reference to the student who's being bullied, not as much to the kid who's doing the bullying, but to this parent, they should know immediately that this has been brought forward, we're investigating it, this is the allegation, and this is where it needs to proceed. For that aspect, that you don't know what could happen that night. That kid could get 3,000 texts that says, go kill yourself.
I agree.
Okay.
I just, having been a school principal, that I had a standard non-negotiable expectation that student did not leave campus until a parent was involved. Even if you didn't have conclusions, they need to know what you do know.
Okay.
Yeah, and I think the thought process was, at least from my perspective, I don't want to speak for Mr. Parento, was that 24 hours, there's times when that's too long. And so we
agreed.
didn't want to send a message that, oh, you just do it, by late afternoon when you get around to it. I think as soon as possible, at least what my thought process was, is the first chance you have,
Mr.
with the information armed to communicate with the parent. But, I'm open
That's
to how
exactly where,
that.
and again, I think we're all talking in a perfect world, but having in the policy, usually having broad, but when it's these severe elements, having something more of a line in the sand, I feel more comfortable with outside of not think, I mean, I wanted to know if there's unforeseen consequences. I don't know.
No, I would say from the direction of the conversation, we could go back and take a look and be more prescriptive in that timeline, because I do feel there's a consensus that would be the direction we want to go.
I don't think a child can go home without a parent having an awareness of what's going on, even if it's not a conclusion of bullying, but having the same knowledge that we know. That's a standard rule, and if you don't follow it, you're far from the ideal, let's put it that way.
And, yeah, that
Well,
would
it can have
be.
dire consequences. Ultimately, I've been there in the district for 22 years on this end, and it has dire consequences because of exactly that
Ditto,
reason.
I never allowed
Because
a
you don't-
student to go home
right.
without this happening.
Because the parent needs to know, because almost 100% of the time, the child is being bullied, all they want it to be is to be stopped. So they never come forward to the parent. So they ultimately do that. So then all of a sudden you're saying as soon as possible, and that was when we originally did the checklist and we did it. The rational decision was, we said within one day, was because of, we wanted to say within one day, which is
then
a little
you
bit more
mentioned
than
that
saying before the child goes home, because ultimately it should be before that child goes home from the school day, the parent should be notified in reference to the bullying allegation and that there is an investigation in place, which ultimately the reason for the timetable on it, which was best practices of 10 days at the time, was because then what it did is it made it so that it didn't turn into deliberate indifference, which was that piece of, we're going to do it when we do it at that time when we get to it. So what happened is boys will be boys was the whole thing, right? And then they would let him work itself out. Well, it never worked, and that was the deliberate indifferences, to that. So that's why we put this standard of a final to be able to get exactly what was occurring. So that's why I'm okay with the 15, because then it gives you a little extra leeway to set up counseling, set up stuff, do stuff. You might have to do an awareness, the threat assessment, mental, who knows? But then it could get into, though I'm pretty sticking to my guns in reference to the notification, because I just don't think that, even though that we know the intention of the administrator wouldn't be to leave it to open-ended for another week, but I think that as long as you put the regulation in there, because of this is so substantial,
Yep.
if you look at violent crime and/or suicidal ideation, that this is significant in reference to that this is the number one issue within children.
I want to overemphasize that and concur with it, and also add in the social media piece. Typically, there's a social media element to 100% of this, and when they leave school, not to say that it isn't happening in the restroom or in some secluded opportunity, they're right on that social media. No, it's got to be quick.
So if you don't mind, we'll allow Deb Jackalone to.
Am I on? Green light?
Oh, there we go.
you go.
Hey, yes, many people at this table are aware of this, but our internal process is exactly what Mr. Enos was describing, that our checklist calls for the immediate notification, and it spells out within 24 hours. It must happen for both notification of the target and the, the alleged target and the alleged offender. So for all the reasons you just said, that was, we did have a lot of conversation about that timeline and what it meant. So our internal process does call for that notification to happen that day.
That same day, so, same day, not 24 hours.
It says within 24 hours of the start of the investigation that we notify them.
So I think we need to change that, because I think, I mean, just hearing with Mr.
I major recommend changing it. I mean, a decade, I never let them go home without the parent knowing. You're just multiplying the issue.
And part of our discussion as we were working through this policy was that in Section 9, it says that parents need to be notified within 1 day. And then in Section 13, that first section is of claims of a violation of the bullying and harassment policies. They need to be notified within 1 day. And then in Section 13, it says that parents or guardians need to be notified of an investigation on the same day. So we were trying to provide some consistency in
Yeah.
there. And based on the conversation, it sounds like the will of the board is to make that on the same day in both places.
Yes, Mr. Edwards?
Yeah, so in my world, we call it close of business. So before the close of the day, the parent has to be notified. I think it has to be a little bit more specific to, before the end of the school day.
Or before child would go. I'm thinking of application insight, because that's why I said, I know the reason we have broader aspects, but some of these are risky, and then we find ourselves, oh, why did this happen? So I'm glad that we're all on the same page there. I think my only question with, because I agree in practice of before that child goes home, at least an outreach of some sort to the parent and guardian to keep them abreast of what occurred. Again, from the application, I'm not trying to give excuses, but I'm trying to think of an in real time. What if it happens on a weekend? What if it happens on these things? I want to make sure our policy is such, so same day, or you use both, because if this, not then this. That's what I just want to make sure from a policy standpoint, we don't have this gray area and people are like, well, maybe it's Monday, and it should be that same day.
It has to be before, I'm adamant that it has to be before that student arrives home, even if the close of business day is 7 or 8 o'clock at night because of school events. It has to be before that student arrives home. Imagine a parent hearing from their child of what happened for them, and no one at school has contacted them. And it was a rule that we could attain for over a decade. I mean, you have a whole entire staff. It isn't, narrowed down to where it has to be the guidance counselor, it has to be the assistant principal. You have a whole building of resources, and if you allow that child to go home and not let that parent know that there's an investigation started, I can't even agree.
So I think we all, just from a language standpoint, before the child, or in the appropriate legal posture, but before they go home, and in the event of a weekend, because that's the only part, I just want to make sure we have within an X time frame.
It's the same thing in regards to, like, say, in the Baker Act. You have to make an immediate notification of the parent. And so it should say, upon receiving the complaint, if you don't want to get to, but it would ultimately should be the immediate notification of the parent. Because once that was opened and anybody who's worked in that environment,
Works for me.
that child who is the victim of the bullying, it says all of a sudden the closet door opens up because it has to be repeated, it has to be an imbalance of power. The amount of information and now being the potential criminality, that whole door, just when it opens, the whole entire thing falls out because the kid is finally like, thank you that somebody's there. So that's why by the end of the day, however you want to word that, but prior to the release, but it should be immediacy based upon this due to all those other social implications that come down. Because ultimately that's where we provide the very best service, because it may be the only service that child gets.
So you guys have direction to improve the language that will catch both day of school, but also in the interim, it being in a weekend non-school day.
Because even if it happens over the weekend, technically the notification isn't until Monday, but technically you're going to, if that's the policy within the day, it doesn't matter if it's Saturday.
That's right. Well,
Principals are 24/7.
I agree. That's
So it's law
the
enforcement.
language to be such that
So
it makes sense.
Exactly.
Good. All right.
Just for clarity purposes, going back to the 15 days schools, are we going to amend that?
Both.
Was there any consensus around
That was on
back
F.
to 10?
I'm fine with the 15. I know that at one point, the best practice was 10, and, I think 15 to be able to have the finality of it, I think would be reasonable based upon services. Does that sound reasonable? Yes. That gives us a little bit more extra opportunity to do a better and more thorough job, but it just has to have an endpoint. That was the whole piece. It has to have an endpoint so that it didn't turn into, hey, suck it up, go back to, so that there was an endpoint so that the parent knew and we don't. Because I get a lot of calls on, their child's being bullied, what is, and I refer them directly back to the policy. Because as a parent, this is one of the policies, I would say that to the public, this is one of the policies that every parent should know as it relates to this, because it is, the cyber piece on this is the biggest problem, I would say, that students from middle school up have an issue with. Is the cyberbullying piece based upon exactly what we're putting in the policy.
I'm glad we covered that. I do have and I don't have the language highlighted here. It's more theoretical. Bullying, harassment, and I'm glad we're including, it's the workplace environment. And if the bullying or harasser is not a member of staff, but is a member of public or family, I just want to make sure if we have a parent bullying or harassing a member of staff, is that now, that's encompassing in this? Okay. All right.
And again, let's say it was somebody from the outside that was doing it to somebody and they had no children or whatever, it still potentially has criminality with it.
Okay.
So it would be reported to potentially school police, who then would reach out to Sheriff's Office,
Okay,
SPD,
perfect.
VPD, Northport PD.
Thank you
for
for
further
clearing that up. Thank you. All right.
Well, and just to dovetail into the next one, I think 2.70 is intended for bullying and harassment, whereas I think 2.71 is more geared towards based on protected classifications.
Okay.
Sexual harassment, the Title IX
Correct.
stuff, all that stuff.
Correct. Good point. Good. That's a good clarification. Sometimes they do blend, but
Well,
separating.
sometimes you can have just someone's being a bully.
Correct.
Sometimes
And
there's
it's not
more to
including
it.
the
It's
protected
racially
class.
based, or that takes it to
Title.
a different level. Not that the first one's not serious.
Correct. Thank you, Mrs. Jacqueline. Okay. Well, we got somewhere on that one. So then we're moving on to 2.71.
Yes, moving forward to 2.71, we had the same group of folks in the room for the discussion of this policy. Changed the terms again to acknowledge the state and federal protected classifications. Once again, added the inclusion of someone being made aware of discrimination or harassment as required to report that incident, requiring parent/guardian notification. Once again, we can change that to on the same day to mirror the language that we just discussed for policy 2.70, adding the HOPE scholarship program eligibility to this one as well. There's also an accompanying procedure, 2.71A, which is the procedures for filing a complaint that needs to be revised. I know that Mr. Duggan worked through some changes on that. I spoke with Dr. Foster yesterday, and we're planning to get together again this week to work through that one. And this is one that right now we're just looking for that permission to notice that we're planning these changes, and we'll have all of that stuff ready to go to the board as soon as possible.
And just that one gets it. That's where the rubber meets the road on implementing in practice what we're going to do based on these policies.
Correct.
And there's a lot of technicalities with Title IX and things like that we're accomplishing a lot in these policies, but they apply to students, they apply to employees, they apply to protected classes, they don't apply to protected classes. But when you have an investigation, there are different legal requirements that go with and best practices that go depending on which of those things there are. So getting that on paper in an organized way that's concise so that people who are reading this policy know what to do. We try to make it a roadmap. It's taking a little bit more time, but I'm confident we will get a good product to you all very quickly.
And just for historical note, the 2.71A, if I'm correct, is unusual to see, and I think many of you guys know this, but for anyone listening, you don't usually see those kind of attachments to a lot of policies. However, for clarity and procedural as well, I believe it even went down to the identification of forms to use so that there was no risk factor. Because there are so many categories, if you're talking about student versus employee or what have you, I think it was a best practice from a risk management standpoint. So making sure that that lines up with the amended policy language is our goal, and that's what you're going to be working on, finalizing.
Yeah, that's what we're literally, it's an ongoing process, and we have already met on it. We've already gone
Okay.
through it. I have reviewed it, and, it's just not complete yet.
Gotcha. But, okay. Any questions, comments?
Yeah,
Go
the
ahead,
other thing
yeah.
I would have is I know when we look at it, is also on page 10, the bottom paragraph that was added. I would also put in there, obviously, that should also the same as we would have in the other policy in reference to the notification, as you pointed out. The other thing, too, in there is, I don't know if I like that the notification could, to parents or regarded maybe by telephone, writing, or personal conference. I think that, it should be something of, do I really want to notify them by a letter? And that's where I saw that in the verbiage in there, and I understand it is, but it's by any means that you might have to. But I would just say that it's too overreaching when I read it, that it could say, okay, I'll mail you the letter, it's 5 days in the mail, and I don't know based on this significance of this.
Which one you're on 10?
Page 10 at the bottom, in the new verbiage, it says, in applicable case, notification of the parents' legal guardians may be made by telephone, writing, or personal conference. All parents, legal victims, and perpetrators who have been received notification may participate in each stage, which is fine. It's just the reference to the notification piece,
And you said by all means, as a replacement, which I like.
which I'd like,
read a
which
little.
would go to, it would ultimately would just show that, again, if you're saying within the day or whatever, by the end of business, I think it would be the same thing, that
agree.
they should be notified.
Absolutely.
I agree.
Instead of saying we could mail them.
It's the same concept.
No, I
as
agree.
We
Yeah,
already
yeah.
deliberated.
That would be the only thing in reading the policies. I thought the rest of it was.
Yeah, and I think writing could include electronic mail as well. So, that could encompass that, or we could be more specific.
I would say be more specific
I do
in the
too. Yeah, and
specificity
I think that-
of the actual notification, because again, by the end of the day, by the end of the business, by all means necessary, ultimately, that there would have to be some acknowledgement if you did by email that they received it, so that they would be, because again, you're talking about a different level, employee to employee.
Yep.
That's a whole nother
I-
avenue in reference to investigation.
Well, I think the key is to do the notice as soon as possible, or whatever language we settle on. The writing can come, it's not as important to follow up and a confirmation in writing, as long as you get an initial notice to somebody and document that, I think is more important.
It's not fester, yeah, and I do think, again, the explicit language in these policies is worthwhile, so. So did you get those notations? You guys good? Okay. Thank you. Are there any additional items on the 2.71? So we went through A. Are there any comments? We're good? Then 2.73?
Yes, moving on to 2.73, you should have, I believe, multiple versions of this policy, one that Ms. Tompkins gave you today. In working with Mr. Duggan over the last few days on trying to craft this policy in the most appropriate, statutorily applicable way. His recommendations are on that new version that we received today, updating the language to protected classifications based on state and federal statutes for continual coverage and compliance with those laws. Changing professional development to professional learning. That's just a new Department of Education term. They're no longer using professional development, they're using professional learning. Adding that instruction must be in accordance with state standards and delivered in an age-appropriate manner. And then taking out the community partners reference and the equity committee at the end of that policy on pages 4 and 5. Was there anything that I missed on that one based on your recent changes?
No, and I will just say that the intent for my review was to tie it as closely to, there's a Department of Education rule on equity, which is 6A19. There is a state statute, 1000.05, and I tried to mirror the language there. Obviously, equity can be a challenging topic that with many people having many different ideas on. So the thought process from my review on that was to tie it to the standards that the state of Florida establishes and imposes us and requires us to follow.
Yep, works for me. Are we okay? And 4.20?
So we'll skip over 4.20 and 4.22 right now because those are instructional materials. Those will be covered by
Oh,
Ms.
Good.
O'Day and Ms.
Sorry about
Meckler in just a little while. But the next one that we have is a new policy, 5.65, which is another one that you should have an additional copy of based on Mr. Duggan's revisions to try to align that as closely as possible with what the statutes and the rules say. This is a new policy to comply with HB 15/2021 and updating definitions in accordance with the Safety and Private Spaces Act, exceptions in accordance with state law, and providing the definitions of what each of these facilities means, as well as making sure that we provide the district team with the accompanying state forms that are required that we have to submit, verifying the designation of each of the district's current facilities, as well as making sure that we are aware that we must submit new forms for all new buildings in the future.
Okay. Okay. All right. Then, did we conclude all of them?
So then just, these are some other ones that are being worked on right now on this final slide, 2.71A, as we just mentioned. 7.85 is the online educational agreements and contracts. 5.305 is on threat assessment teams, which is now going to be changed to threat management teams based on the state guidance. 4.20 and 4.22, which again, Ms. O'Day and Ms. Meckler are going to cover here in just a few minutes. And then there are some additional ones that are being worked on right now that we'll have to provide to you as a board moving forward. But these are all of the policies, I believe 17 of them in total, that we're asking for that permission to begin the public noticing process so that we can start that timeline and try to get these things adopted here over the next couple of months.
Any questions? Again, this process is like, I'm speechless, which never happens. But it is a huge improvement. Thank you, and thank you. Thank you, everyone, for doing your due diligence ahead of time so that you can provide your areas of expertise in this. And as soon as we get this, it'll be a new legislative session will have been completed, and then we'll continue on. My only final question would be is that once the board adopts the final versions, and then the process then gets sent over to our communications department so that it's properly uploaded, all of those things. Yep. All right.
So just one ask or request. So there is this 14-day period that we come to you for consensus around, and I would ask, and we don't have to answer it today, but if we are ready to update a particular policy, if I could have the board's agreement to allow me to go ahead and move forward with that 14-day process, so that it'll expedite this even faster, because it's going to come forward to you in a workshop anyway. And that's another thing that I'll be able to update the board on is a proposed policy revision cycle happening quarterly. So we will do this on a quarterly basis. We may do this a little more frequently now just to get the backlog moving. But if I could request your permission that when we're ready to begin revising policy, that you allow me to go ahead and get that 14-day process started immediately, I would appreciate that. Thank you.
If I may, to that point, I completely agree with the superintendent on that, because we also are working around time deadlines that are set statutorily, but then they don't always correspond to our calendar that we have here. And so it can take longer, actually, if we have to come before you and say, hey, can we start? Then look at the calendar and say, okay, when's the next board meeting? We got a little taste of that this summer with the Student Code of Conduct and the Student Progression Plan, which we literally began in like mid-May as soon as the legislative session was over. And we weren't able to get passed until April, the way the calendar fell. And with everything else going on in the district over the summer. So I think that is useful for the district staff and the superintendent, and gives the superintendent the flexibility needed to move us all forward in a way, but yet still allows for the transparency and the public involvement and the board's input on those policies. But ultimately, from a statutory standpoint, you all are responsible for policies to approve or not approve. But it's a tap dance between superintendent and board, and that, I think, is a perfect blend of the two different parties' roles in this.
I absolutely agree.
Yes. Yes.
This is
Impressive, yes.
I'm very, very happy about this.
Very
This has been-
impressive.
I know Mr. Duggan can attest to how much back-end work from the policy standpoint. So this is a much improved, streamlined, and efficient. So thank you.
10-minute break.
10-minute break after we, so I can't see that because it's glared. So 2:50, we'll reconvene. Does that work? All right, well, we're going to come back early because that's the kind of day it is. So, Mr. Connor, if you'd like to introduce our next presenters.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair. At this time, we're going to have our Chief Academic Officer and Rachel O'Day and Ms. Sue Meckler present an update on instructional materials processes as it relates to new legislation.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Connors. Mr. Connors said this is not new policy, just updated. You guys have workshopped this before. So with new House bills that came through over the summer, there was a need to make adjustments and updates to that policy and additional feedback that board members have also given along the way. So at this time, I'm going to hand it over to Sue, and she will walk you through the updates to these policies.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's great to see you, and thank you for allowing us the time to share these updates. I did want to say that Mr. Manoogian is not happy that he's not here today, but he had a previously scheduled engagement. He would like to be here sharing all of this with you. But we'll chat after.
But we all recognize the immense work that is all over this.
Absolutely,
Yes.
absolutely. So to start, I just want to remind you all that last year we brought you 3 policies related to instructional materials. And at that time, based on the feedback, we combined those 3 into 2, and we also renamed them. I think it was Mr. Edwards that brought up, that the titles of these policies were rather confusing. And there was not real clarity in what policy meant what. So now we have 4.20, which is instructional materials, evaluation, selection, and objection to use. And then policy 4.22, which is specific to library media center materials, evaluation, selection, and objection to use. So I think that makes it more transparent for our public, our families, our community, et cetera, et cetera. Today we're going to share the updates included based on House Bill 1069 and additional revisions that needed to be made, as well as some internal changes we decided to make, again, based on your feedback last year when we presented. 4.20, I want to remind you again, is specific to textbooks and materials used in a classroom for instruction. And 4.22 is about self-selected reading. And that would be materials from our school media centers as well as our classroom libraries. When we look to HB 1069, this bill really was meant to enhance the transparency and review of library and classroom materials made available to our students and the process for parents to limit students' access should they choose that, specifically to self-selected reading, and we'll talk about that opt-out process that we have in place. And also for our families to make objections to specific instructional materials, including library books. Specifically, this bill does require that anything with alleged pornography or obscene depictions of sexual conduct, as identified in current law, must be removed immediately pending the outcome of the objection. It also states that we must discontinue the use of any material the board does not allow a parent to read aloud at a school board meeting. Lastly, all committee meetings that are held regarding an objection now must be noticed to the public. Before, we used to have our objection committees meet at the school, at the district. Now all of those must be noticed and open to the public and provide that appeal process. That appeal process could include a magistrate once it got to the district level if someone said we did not follow our own policy and procedures. We won't need a magistrate. I am confident we will follow our policy and procedures. The next piece is about the classroom library scanning that was a requirement of our K-5 elementary schools. You might remember that we piloted this process at Tuttle Elementary last year to make sure that we had a system in place that would be easy for our teachers and our schools. So far, I will tell you, we have nearly 400,000 books that have been scanned to date, and our schools are working very hard and diligently to meet our deadline. That deadline will be October 12th for all elementary classroom libraries to be fully scanned, and then by October 19th, all of that will be visible, meaning that each school's website and our district website will have a list where parents can get on and see specifically what is in their child's classroom library. Mr. Parento will be working with our communications department to make sure that everybody understands that and that, again, it's front-facing, anybody can look at any time. Just as a reminder, currently, anyone can search what's in our media centers. So that's always been available. For any school across the district, parents can search for particular titles at our schools. DOE has not expanded this requirement yet for the scanning of 612 classroom libraries. But should that take place, we will be ready to go and use the same process that we've used at elementary. It's been very successful. A lot of work. Kudos to our teachers and our schools that are working through this. And then we also are working through the process to make sure we are maintaining and keeping this process up to date. So as new teachers come into the district, a teacher changes schools and takes their library, we need to make sure that we're doing that. Teachers get new things that are brought in, whether it's somebody donating a book or whatever. We have to work through that process to make sure we continue to add and keep those lists up to date. And I want to do a huge shout out to our 3 new district media specialists. Reminder, 3 new district media specialists. They are really out in our schools, building relationships with those library techs and our school-based administrators, providing that support, really looking at how they can build those collections at our schools as well. So, policy 4.22. This is really going back to this idea of challenges. As you know, in our district, we've had very few challenges, and those challenges have been handled appropriately through committees. Last year, I believe, Mr. Edwards, you brought up the fact that you were concerned about how much time and energy and money and people were involved in these challenges. So one of the things we've decided to do as a district is, first, it always starts with that conversation between if I was the parent and Ms. O'Day was my administrator or the principal of the school, I would go in and have a conversation about the concern I have about a particular book. If that is not resolved at the school level, we will take it immediately to the district level, avoiding the school having to do that challenge and all the time and energy it takes. That will go then directly to instructional materials, and we will have that committee that is made up of teachers of the appropriate level, administrators, community, et cetera. But avoiding that one step, we think, will save time, money, and energy. If there's a decision to challenge the district decision, it will go to the school board just as it has done in the past. We will provide all those necessary materials to you so that you can review specifically how those decisions were rendered, and we will go from there. We also have made the decision that as professionals in the Instructional Materials and Library Services Department, with those 3 district media specialists, our new library manager, and Mr. Manugian, that if there is a book that is brought to the table that we believe should be removed immediately, we have the right to do that. In other words, something slipped through the cracks and this book has adult content. We want to be able to say, we're pulling it, we're not going to go through a full review, that objection is valid, and we will stop at that point. Next is this concept of the library opt-out that I mentioned early on. 1069 does mandate that we have a specific process in place for parents to opt out of their child having access to our media centers or classroom libraries. Currently, we have a Microsoft Office form that will be placed on the district website. Again, a communication plan is essential in this to make sure everyone knows where that's at, how to access it, that it is available. And we plan to roll that out at the same time we release the elementary classroom library lists. That is a stopgap for this year only, meaning that parents this year can use that form, say, yes, I do not want my child to have access, or it's fine to have access, and that's specific to school library as well as classroom library. Moving forward, as we do our annual registration and re-registration process, they will have that right within that process in the new Focus system. So we won't have to do this form and have it be a separate entity. It'll just be part of the normal registration. School library book purchase process. So again, those 3 district media specialists beginning last January, we did contract with them. They were all working in our schools as teachers, and we contracted with them to begin that vetting process. They also worked over the summer, and to date, they have vetted 3,000 books. In vetting those 3,000 books, they paid close attention to those Sunshine Young State Reader books that schools purchase annually. Those books had been sitting in a box when we froze books last year, so we wanted to make sure those could be vetted and get on their shelves. We also were proactive in making sure we had this year's list vetted. That also includes the Florida Teen Reads books. In addition to that, at middle school, we have a new novel bunch book club this year for our striving readers, and there were 26 titles there that we vetted to make sure were included across the district that would be available for purchase as well. And then there's something called Junior Library Guild, in which some schools have subscriptions, and we're making sure we're vetting those books, again, to be proactive to support the schools. So if a PTO offers a school, $1,000 to add new books, they now have at least 3,000 books to start to look at, and we're developing that ongoing process to continue to add more and more. Textbook adoption policy 4.20. So you know the fun we had with this starting last spring, and worked through the textbook adoption process in May and June. We did complete our voting September 7th. And based on our timeline, we were bringing to you today what the outcomes of that was. However, we are going to postpone that till October 3rd. It doesn't change the end date of our timeline, but we wanted to make sure we did a little bit of cleanup on some of that data. And we had a math high school textbook that we had a tie. So we're making sure we go back and offer that opportunity for teachers who didn't potentially take the opportunity to vote for that textbook to have that opportunity so we can break that tie. The next piece, and I know, Ms. Ziegler, this is near and dear to your heart, which is the idea of Insignia being our new pilot program for possibly replacing our current Destiny library management system. We brought this again to you last spring and got the green light go to say, yes, let's pilot it. We are going to start our training at the end of September with implementation approximately mid-October, and we have 6 schools who have agreed to be part of this pilot. That agreement came from principals working alongside their library media techs. As you can see, we have all levels represented for elementary, middle, and high school. The advantages we see of this new program is that ability to have the built-in classroom library management system, so we won't have to have that separate libib that we're currently using. It also provides that opportunity for parents to flag a book or a specific group of titles of books within the system. There are easy reports to run from this new system, so we're very excited about the possibility, but again, pilots are really important because we don't want to jump in to the deep end and find out there are some glitches along the way. So just the update is, we're going to start soon. And that's the updates for instructional materials and library services and policies 4.20 and 4.22. Questions and or comments?
Well, it says thank you at the end. Well, thank
welcome.
you, because I know this has been a lot of work and across the state, and there's been a lot of challenges with it. And we're onward and upward, that's all I'm going to say. So I appreciate the processes. Mr. Edwards, go ahead.
One quick question, because I know the math textbooks that we had to replace were problematic. Did we, and Mr. Duggan, you may be part of this conversation too, I think it was McGraw-Hill that we had those from. Is McGraw-Hill part of the tie of the replacement?
This is particularly for the high school Math for College algebra course, which we have about 20 teachers across the district, and the tie was split 6-6. As far as the two publishers, off the top of my head, I can't tell you who those were, but we could find it very quickly.
Well, my question really was that the textbook was problematic and the workbooks didn't match the textbooks, and I know that some parents even went so far as to have to hire tutors. And I wouldn't want us just to walk away from that conversation. I thought that McGraw-Hill had been trying to find a way to resolve the problem for us. And in that, I mean, I hope we don't have to pay for them or we get some sort of credit. That's just my business brain coming through. So I'm hoping that there'll be a full circle conversation about how that situation is getting resolved.
So I will tell you that when we bring back these results to you October 3rd, I want to say that our teachers, I believe, did their due diligence in looking at the various programs that were presented to them. I also think we have to give credit and kudos to our teachers for knowing our new standards, knowing what the needs of their students are, and how to meet the needs of all those learners. Regarding some of the concerns we had with the McGraw-Hill Reveal K-12 math program last year, they were certainly aware of some of the concerns we brought to the table. There's ongoing conversations about that with them, and we are doing everything in our power to make sure that we're giving our teachers the best tool possible. Thank you. You're welcome.
Thank you very much. Are there any questions? Mrs. Rose?
Just well done, thank you.
I know this, we didn't go, there's been a lot of conversation and meetings and workshops throughout the past year, but I really do want to thank Mr. Manoogian, Dr. Cantalupo. Thank you for the work that you guys have done and really minimizing any disruption to our students, and I appreciate all the staff hanging in there as we improve our processes. So I don't have any questions, comments. Mr. Connor, are there any additional items on the agenda outside of, I mean, we can go to comments after that, but from presentation standpoint, we're concluded?
Yes, we are concluded. I appreciate your time and effort. It looks like we've got done in record time here today. I thought I bit off more than I could chew, but we were able to get it all done. As I said earlier, I do have a proposed calendar forecast. I know at a retreat we had talked about forecasting out what those workshops will look like moving forward. So I will send those to you and have some one-on-one conversations. It is not in its complete form because there will be topics that will come up throughout the year that we'll need to have available time to talk about. But those things that we do know, legislative platform, strategic plan, achievement, all of those things will be built already into the calendar. And so,
and just from a board member standpoint, evaluations and preparation for that, I think include those in there. I know that because that helps us prepare, and then any other statutory requirements that we have as well. So good stuff.
Also, I just happen to see if you look at the student social media guidelines, second page, there's a sentence that's left off in the disciplinary chart. So it ends at disciplinary action may,
Dot, dot, dot.
and it is in the staff one. I just wanted to point that out since it is a draft.
No, that's a good
Ends on
point.
May.
Thank you.
So it's,
No, that's a good highlight. I'm sorry, we sure it should be may or shall. No, good catch. Thank you very much. Were there any comments by board members? I know we have Mr. Enos.
Yeah, I was just going to say thanks to everybody, especially like shout out to Mr. Dugan. I know that, the big thing that's close to my heart is to make sure that we are within the Florida state statutes and we are compliant, because ultimately that limits all of our liability based upon how those processes and the statutes are made and they come down. I know that due to his due diligence with the staff and everybody else here that's involved is that's something that is exceptional. And I can tell you also when we first got these policies and we were supposed to figure out, this is how it should have always been with the red highlights and to show us the changes. So I am super, super thankful because this ultimately allows us to do our work, to be able to move forward to being, as Mr. Connor said, to be able to get these out running in the 14, to get those posted. And like I said, I just wanted to thank Mr. Dugan. I know that his diligence is, I know for me, I very much appreciate that because obviously I'm a person about the statutes. So thank you.
I concur. Mrs. Rose.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I do want to recognize Superintendent Connor and all of the staff. There are systems that are obviously in place that were very much needed, and the smoothness of that process and the procedures and timelines are phenomenal, so very welcome. And I do want to reinforce as well that we all know that is the foundation for us to start being able to see academic achievement grow for all of our students, and I wanted to thank everyone for that.
Mr. Edwards.
Yes, I'd like to also, I really did enjoy Mr. Parento. That was a welcome change all the way around, much less angst, and quickly got through. And I think we all want to comply. I mean,
Right.
there's no reason to try and skirt any of those issues, and how do we do that and make it as painless as possible? But I do want to bring up and just talk a little further about something that we've talked about this before, maybe not so much to you, but I think that it is important, especially as we're giving ourselves a little time here, and that's why I'm bringing it up, that we have some ESSER challenges coming up, period. And what has never really occurred here is some kind of review of our programs that we purchase, relationships that have been established with vendors, and so forth and so on. What happened in our conversation last night can be avoided if school board members don't like programs or don't think something's working. They should be bringing that to your attention, and you should be, and my hopes are that you're asking for that in a regular basis, in addition to some sort of formal review process. I also know, and this is, again, just my business brain talking, that sometimes because we have autonomy with our principals, they purchase programs, and then we find out that 5 schools purchased the program, and if we had consolidated it, we might have gotten a better price. So there's a whole procedure that can happen here that has yet to happen, and I'd like to, the sooner we can have board members contribute, and in that conversation, the less angst we will have on the dais, would be my hope. That's feedback that I'm throwing back on your lap to say we as board members should be responsible enough to bring you things that we're dissatisfied with on our own. But at the same time, we need to have a better program of how we purchase, when we purchase, how it's reviewed, when we discontinue, all of those kinds of things.
Thank you for the feedback and the timely conversation. Actually, Ms. O'Day and I had a lot of conversation yesterday, including Mr. Renoff, about the timeline for this off-ramp for ESSER. We're facing some challenges. You know, we've got 147 positions currently that are funded, that are filled. We have 182 budgeted on ESSER right now, and so we've got to develop that off-ramp and land that plane come September of 2024. So we've already initiated a timeline to have those discussions in a way that we can do that methodically and bring that information to the board to talk about what that plan is and get your feedback on that. So timely, thank you for that suggestion.
Mrs. Rose.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I do want to say from the opportunity of working with several superintendents and having opportunities for professional development, working with outstanding staff, that inherently in the instruction and learning process is the metrics, the data piece constantly being assessed. And Mrs. Meckler is shaking her head yes, because when we're in an ideal place, that's going to happen inherently, and that's when you start to see achievement grow. And I think that we have a superintendent and staff and leadership that are going to take us there. I'm confident of that.
I agree. Any more comments? Are you thinking about saying something? I can see her face. Okay. I actually agree. I know we've talked about programs before. I looked right over at you because I remember even during the retreat you mentioning that. But I do think it is important to not only for the board but for the public to understand, particularly with ESSER, that there are some challenges ahead, and they're not going to be all things coming up roses. Today was a great meeting, but there are going to be some challenging conversations. My hope, and I think this was demonstrated by just I do believe it's applicable because it was very much systems related. You know, Mr. Duggan and I have worked hours on a variety of policy items. I've worked with other people as well. Dr. Foster worked a lot, but I think that there was, again, years in the making, looking in the past. There has been a system, a procedural process when it comes to policies that just really wasn't connecting, and it really was. It's the board to the administrative aspect. So I'm not joking. Today was wonderful, but it was laid out not only the preparedness for the board to do their due diligence, but also the way in which it was set up with even for the public to follow along, the track changes. So you have and I use that as hopefully that's just an example of what we will see coming forward, process-wise, to make decisions easy, hard, whatever they are, and that makes our job much, much easier to really deliberate with a clear head and a respectful mind to make those decisions, and I think everyone wins then. So I am super happy about today, but I'm confident about as we go forward with that in mind, so we can have those evaluations of some of those programs so that it's all about student achievement. So I'm very excited.
And everybody's smiling.
I like that. Let's keep it that way, huh?
I would like to just add that I've worked with Mrs. Meckler for many, many years and many people in this room, and in the past, we did have many systems in place. And over these years that they went away, that did caused a lot of angst. And we did review programs. We did review things, what worked, what didn't work. So that is not anything new. And I have certainly brought my concerns forward to Superintendent Connor, and the people that were our interim superintendents, because that's the way it always was of work. So I really appreciate what everybody has contributed to today, because I feel like I'm back in an environment that Sarasota County was known for.
I feel like we grew up.
And well, we re-grew up. We put the systems back. So thank you, Superintendent Connor, very much, and your staff for making this day be so smooth. And I feel like we're back on course again. So thank you.
So if there are no additional comments, we have a 6:30 school board meeting in Venice at the VPAC, and we will stand adjourned until then. So thank you, everyone, for the great work. Great workshop. All right.